we can probably link anything to anything in 6 mouse clicks. Now what, you might ask, does any of this have to do with teaching? It's a great question. I currently teach high school music at Brookfield Academy. It's a K-12 private school up in Wisconsin. And while I'm old enough to remember a world without the internet, my students are not. My students have grown up in a world where everything is miscellaneous. It's not neatly sorted and organized by topic or discipline anymore. It's tossed into a massive digital pile and left for us to comb through in our own time and in our own way. One of my students might go online, play 6 wikis of chemistry, and find themselves on an entry more easily associated with history, the 30th dynasty of Egypt. And then, oh, I should Google that. And then you Google that, and there's 3 more articles, and suddenly 10 minutes later, you're reading about something that, on the surface, is completely unrelated to your starting point. My students are growing up in a world where it's never been clearer how seemingly separate bodies of knowledge in fact cross paths all the time. And their teachers and schools need to embrace this new reality if they're going to learn to navigate it. Now, you might argue that doing so results in the accumulation of random facts, disconnected from any sense of great truth, and ultimately just trivia wafting around in the void. But what if it actually leads to deeper understanding? 40 years ago, in a lecture at Harvard University, the great American composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein recalled his undergraduate career and how he learned to think of music in terms of poetry and aesthetics, linguistics, and physics. He summed up his experience and his philosophy by saying the best way to know a thing is in the context of another thing. Well, far be it from me to disagree with Lenny, but I think we're approaching a moment when it's the only way. And it's for this reason that I've come to embrace interdisciplinary education as more than a buzzword or a fad. In allowing different disciplines to cross paths in our classroom, we're embracing a model of instruction tailor-made for how this generation has grown up acquiring knowledge. And what's more, it's helped me lead students who thought themselves unmusical to see that musicality is more than a set of skills and talents one either has or doesn't. It's a way of thinking that's absolutely informed by other disciplines. For example, geometry. You can see behind me a score called Bruno bars. This is the product of a 6th grader I worked with as a student teacher. And this young lady was initially convinced, like her classmates, that music composition was something that had simply passed her by. She would never be able to do it. And so inspired by the fact that they were studying geometry during the time that I was working with them, and the fact that geometry and music share several terms in common, intersection, parallel, oblique, each with mathematical and musical meaning, I decided to use geometry as a gateway into composition, and I gave each student a set of lines and angles to set to music. They did so brilliantly. You can see how the line going straight across corresponds to one pitch, repeated over and over, and the ascending line corresponds to a set of ascending pitches. It's geometry in C major. And when she'd finished writing this piece and performing it for the class, she came running up to me after class to excitedly ask, "Is that really all it is?" And then asked for a harder set of lines and angles to set to music the next day. And she was far from the only student to react so positively. I found myself surrounded by 6th graders so excited at the prospect that writing music does not depend on being a dead German man. And I rate that unit as among one of the most successful and meaningful I've ever taught. And the basic idea would be true if I taught English or chemistry and had a student who believed they just couldn't do it. I wonder about the ways a math teacher might reach a student musically, or how a chemistry teacher could relate ionic and covalent bonds to dance, or how a drama teacher might incorporate economic understanding into Death of a Salesman. My most rewarding moments as a classroom teacher are actually the ones where I reach outside my own discipline to help hesitant or struggling students see, yes, that's really all it is. So it turns out Bernstein was right. The best way to know a thing is in the context of another thing. So this is an example of a product. What does the process look like? The answer might disappoint you, because honestly, an interdisciplinary lesson in my classroom doesn't look much different than any other lesson I would teach. And this is because interdisciplinarity is more than anything else a perspective. It means I look at my course materials in terms of what they might be, and not just what they are. So let's say I was preparing the Hallelujah Chorus by Handel. I would look at it, sure, as a musical work, It's full of musical ideas and concepts, but it's also a literary work. It has a text that reflects the time, place, and values of its creation. It's a historical document. It's full of choices that mark it clearly as a product of the 17th century. And it's an example of symmetry, mathematical, musical, literary. Planning for interdisciplinarity means that I put all of those identities under the microscope at the same time. Dozens of research studies have linked isolation to teachers leaving the profession. That more frequent collaboration between classrooms could relieve the sense of my classroom as my island. Because discussion is absolutely where it starts. Conversation between teachers within disciplines and between disciplines, looking for connections, because there really is potential everywhere. A few weeks ago, a student came into my office, so excited to tell me that she was reading The Great Gatsby in English class, but understanding it in terms of the 1920s jazz standards we were studying in chorus. F. Scott Fitzgerald's descriptions of 1920s excess were made even more vivid with musical context in her head. And most importantly, she found herself with something to say in a class where she ordinarily slinks into the background. Now, I was thrilled for the connections that she had been making, all the while kicking myself for having let them happen by happy accident. In every school I've taught, and I've heard the same conversation, and I have had it so many times than I would care to admit. Teachers realizing overlap between their classrooms only after the fact, usually because a student walks in and says, "Oh, we just talked about that last week in math." And it's my hope that these connections begin to arise more and more on purpose, the result of deliberate planning by teams of teachers working together. Because just as Kevin Bacon might be understood in terms of cheesesteak rolls, music can and should be understood in terms of geometry, geometry in terms of art, and art in terms of music.